Hello and welcome to the Ireland on the Fly podcast about the people and places of fly fishing in Ireland. This week's episode speaks to a remarkable woman, Sally Barnes, who has been at the forefront of the Irish artisan food revolution since the 1980s, when she first started smoking wild salmon. But what has a smoker got to do with fly fishing? Well, Sally, who's been married to a fisherman and lives on the coast, has seen and experienced firsthand the decline the Atlantic salmon has undergone in modern times. Sally's story is a remarkable one and her insights perceptive and well worth listening to. And she first told us how it all began for her in West Cork in the 1970s.
I arrived in West Cork 50 years ago, so I've been here for 50 years, and for 30 of those years, I was married to a commercial inshore fisherman. And for the first few months that I was here, I was his crew on an 18-foot open wooden punt. So I've observed salmon, drift netting for salmon, this was in the day. I've observed the way the fish behave, and that fishery was only allowed, you were only able to go up to 6 miles offshore. The problem then was that trawlers were at it as well, because of course everybody wants to make a bean. And if they saw the small boats making a bean, they'd have to get in on that. And then I can't remember when the government brought in the regulation that it was 12 meters and under only that were allowed to fish salmon. But, you know, in those days, they would start salmon fishing, probably some of them in March, just to hit a few of the big returning spring fish. And then because you noticed that last week in June, first 2 weeks in July would be when the main run of one sea winter would be returning, masses of them. Before then, it would be dribs and drabs. You might get 2, you might get 3, and the same after that date. So, yeah, we'd fish for about 5 months, drift for salmon, and then go over to pot for lobsters or tangle net for whitefish or crayfish and crab, whatever. So I've observed from then. Now, that was 1975 when I came, and Ireland had just acceded to the European Union and just given away 95% of the fish in Irish waters. I mean, they were pristine waters. There wasn't a developed fleet here to speak of. There were small trawlers and lots of little harbours, but there was no kind of cohesion. There was no marketing cohesion. It was up to the trawler, the skipper, to find market. There weren't auctions, it was just find your buyer. So the prices were dictated by the buyers, which suppressed them, of course. But at that stage, when EU negotiations were occurring, when we were the EEC, it was the EEC, wasn't it? The European Economic Community. When we were acceding to it, giving away that fish, the deal was, we'll give you infrastructures for farming. Well, the negotiators for the Irish government at the time would all have been from farming backgrounds. So when they were offered this carrot, we'll give you all these pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, artificial fertilizers. We will improve your roads, your communication systems. So they got this huge package, but now, it wasn't rocket science. The whole cycle for a salmon, one sea winter salmon, would be about 4 years. So 4 years after we acceded to the EU, and in 1979, I'd given up fishing. I was having my second child then. The boat for one day landed the best salmon fishing drift netting ever, and they landed 249 salmon for the day. And you're going, my God, that's great. That means we've got income now for the whole year, because that represented the annual income for those inshore boats. Fantastic, but we didn't get paid. Always the trouble, always the problem, isn't it? There's no market, or there's market and you don't get paid. And so it's a very precarious existence. But it was interesting to watch that from 1979 onwards. I suppose in 1981, I started smoking the fish because we'd been left a bad debt. And in lieu of the monies that we were owed, the individual who'd taken all those salmon from us for that 3 magnificent weeks of fishing gave us his smoking kiln because he had gone out of business. I think there was a bit of drink involved, which was very unfortunate. So he'd smoked the fish that we'd given him, sold the fish and drank it. So then he felt really awkward and embarrassed. So um, he
So you
decided
kind of fell into it by accident, then. Yeah.
totally,
You
totally. But
arrived at it.
well, I
So
trained for teaching, and I was training for teaching in London before I came. So I got to the final year, and I thought, "Yay, be ed, yeah!" And got pregnant, and I thought, "Oh shoot, right." So what are you going to do? I'd been over here for the summer beforehand, and I just thought, "Oh, this is heaven." I'm a Scot, so this just reminded me of Scotland from my childhood. It was open spaces, clean air, clean water, lots of wildlife, lots of insects, a lovely biodiversity, I suppose. So coming here after living in Sussex, parents moved us to Sussex when I was 12. And oh God, it was like another planet. And it really was difficult as an outsider with this weird Scottish accent. So in England, eventually I had to acquire a weird English accent to know any kind of things going on up here, in the cerebral end of things. So stuck at home with two kids, and Colin came home from a lake one evening because when he wasn't commercially fishing, he'd be out with his rod and line, which still was no, it doesn't amuse me. That's what he did. He was a mad keen angler as well because he'd worked angling boats out of Newhaven before he came, and he was here long before I came. So he checked out the lakes, and all the lakes around here had brown trout in them, all of them. And there's a very small lake near Loch Hyne called Ballyalla, and it's tiny, but for some reason it held really big brown trout. And I held the latest record, not that it's recorded, but I caught a 4.5 pound brown trout in there one evening. Absolutely stunning. So he came home from the lake one evening with 5 trout, and we had no freezer, no means of conserving them. I was absolutely livid because one of the children had no teeth. Who's going to eat 5 trout? Not one of which was under 3 pounds. Do you know? Idiot. Oh, so big Barney. So then I thought, well, there's no point in a Barney. Let's talk this through. How did people preserve that incredible protein and that incredible food for times when it wasn't available for whatever reason, out of season or, wrong end of the year? So we started experimenting with smoking fish, and it was mackerel because when I came the first 3 weeks I was here, we ate mackerel every day. And so after 3 weeks, I said, do you know what? I can't eat mackerel anymore. Sorry. Yeah, they're lovely, but no, I've done my lifetime's worth. So I thought they were good to play with because they were freely available, very abundant, a couple of feathers, and you'd have a bucket full. So we experimented, and eventually, when we got the electrically powered smoking kiln, I thought, right now I'm going to have to make a handle of this. So wrote to various fisheries authorities. Coming from Scotland, I knew there was a research facility in Aberdeen called Torry, and Torry Research Facility was part of British government, but they did fisheries research. So I asked them if they'd have any information about smoking fish, and they sent me this huge wodge of brilliant pamphlets about herring and salmon and whiting and, the gamut and how to process it. But those papers had been written in the 1950s and 1960s before vacuum packing, chilled distribution, all of the modern technology that had caught up. So some of the information was incredibly useful, but other bits, you're going, dry salt a side of salmon for 24 hours. You'd make a cricket bat. But then when I asked older people, I'm going, really? This just seems insane. And older people said to me, oh, but you used to see sides of salmon hanging with the salamis and the cured meats over bars, public bars, and people would just cut slices off. So it had to be heavily preserved. It must have been pretty dark, actually. Those were the days you're too young to remember, but people smoked in pubs. They smoked in bars, not just cigarettes, it was pipes, cigars, and you're thinking, oh, yum. So maybe the heavy salting was helping mask some of the nasty smoke.
Tell me this, Sally.
Mm.
Like, nowadays you go to a supermarket and we'll talk about farm salmon in a minute, like, but everything, you see packages as smoked fish, it's part of our menu or part of our cuisine now. What was it like in Ireland in the 1980s in the supermarkets? Was there such a thing as smoked fish, smoked salmon?
Supermarkets, supermarkets, the village shop, which was brilliant. The village shop was a really powerful source of community gathering. That's where you got your up to the second news. And in those times, I mean, times were really hard. We didn't have family here. We didn't have any connections. Colin was doing a bit of crewing for a few other fishermen, so he was on a share wage, which was great if you were getting fish, but it was tough if you weren't. But we were always good at foraging. But the local shop, I was in one day and I had my new baby in the shopping basket, got to the till and I'm counting the pennies, talk about the bean counter. And the proprietor of the shop said, "For God's sake, Sally, the children have got to be warm. They've got to have food. Run a tab. Everybody else runs a tab. We're in a fishing community. We know fine that fish populations rise and fall, incomes rise and fall. So, yeah, you're not making anything at the moment, but that'll come right. And then you can pay us then." That was absolutely fundamental to supporting so many people, not just the blow-ins, it was local people as well. 1980s were really tough. I think interest rates then were up at 23 and 24%. Not that we had any borrowings, but we had an overdraft because when we weren't paid for the fish, you have to pay your crew. So we were paying the crew out of the overdraft, and we spent a very long time in the wrong side of the line between having and not having. But you have to pay your crew.
The decline, did it begin in the 80s in terms of what you saw, or was
Yeah.
it just a gradual drip effect?
It started in the 80s. I suppose he stopped salmon fishing at some point then because the catches were getting so dire. He wasn't making enough money to pay the loans for the new boat, blah, blah. So he stopped salmon fishing. So then I was buying from other licensed dealers in the area, and a woman. It was wonderful because there's so few women involved in most businesses in those days. Women became nurses or teachers or the house, the reserve army of labour keeping the house going. And fishermen's wives are particularly caught up in that because you're single parenting. You don't have a partner at home to go, God, can you just mind the kids before I kill them? Do you know what I mean? You get no escape. And having no family here either, it was very hard work. But I thought, oh God, I've got to do something to contribute to the household income here. So I started buying fish from Betty, and yeah, we would notice, I'd say, geez, there don't seem to be so many fish this year, Betty. What's happening? Oh, Christ, they'll come right because all fish populations fluctuate kind of depending on weather and feed and climate, all of it. So it was lovely to be working with a woman, and she said, "Oh, this is a change in fortune." She said, "You used to come to my door selling us your salmon, and now here you're at my door buying salmon from me." So yeah, and
And
I did.
is that when you decided to focus on the kind of smokery and kind of did that then take off, was it?
Yeah, that's why I was buying the salmon because I realized, I mean, I wasn't legit in those days, but there weren't any inspectors in those days. God be with them. And because of my insecurities, I wasn't going to put anything out there that I didn't feel was safe. So I was a right pedant about it. Would give samples to friends and neighbours, but this is a very multicultural community and has been for a long time. So there were people coming in from outside who understood smoked salmon. I didn't. Had no experience of eating it. Where would I have come across it as a student in London? So it was when we started experimenting and doing it ourselves that I started tasting it and beginning to understand the flavor profiles. So no supermarkets in West Cork. That where there were no, that's not strictly true. there were a couple of bigger shops in Skibbereen who stocked things like cloth-bound cheddar. Otherwise it was Calvita. So there
Yes,
was one,
Calvisa.
you
And
remember
Galtee.
Calvita? Yeah. Thank God for Veronica Steele and the other girls, Jana Ferguson and that came in, Jeffa Gill, that came in and started raw milk cheese making with local cheeses. They were the instigators of a whole new tranche of potential economic activity, for want of a better word. I can't remember if there were any Irish cheeses in the.
I don't think there was, Sally, and it's definitely there's no doubt what you're saying there. I mean,
Yeah.
Irish cheeses today are regarded as absolutely fantastic, and
Yep.
like hundreds of years ago we had tradition, but we lost that. But it sort of it
We did.
blossomed again in your area, and it was a lot
Yep.
of as you said there blow-ins who came in
Yep.
and took the
Yeah.
bull by the horns and got things going, and like really we've got to be very grateful to them because what we have
Absolutely.
now is fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, I
Mm,
think so. And
yeah.
because the community was so multicultural then, there were there was definitely market for it locally. And then people would take, if they came and they bought salmon from me, I didn't have a vacuum packer. God be good to John Field and Skib, because people taking fish back to the continent, I used to just wrap it in greaseproof. But then I thought, oh, crikey, if
Did
they're
it keep?
traveling.
Did it
Hmm?
keep actually? Did it keep in the
It did
greaseproof
keep,
paper?
yeah. I mean, it wasn't great without vacuuming. And then, of course, when vacuum packing became the thing, you could reduce your salt content quite
Ah,
considerably because you were using chilled distribution. It was being sold in chilled shelving in supermarkets. I was giggling yesterday or the day before about one of the markets in Skib. It was the country market, which was on a Friday. This was before the farmers markets got up and running again. The Irish Country Women's Association used to run markets on a Friday, 2 hours on a Friday, and you'd go in on a summer's afternoon and there'd be beautiful plucked and gutted chicken, oven ready chicken in a plastic bag. No sign of any kind of chilling of any description. You're thinking, oh, I don't know if that's safe. But I think in those days, I don't think the bacterium that are of such danger to humans now, I don't think there were as many. That salmonella wasn't part of the it wasn't part of the scheme because most of the chickens would have been free range and out of doors. So the levels of salmonella in those birds would be much lower than those kept in batteries.
looking on the historical side there, Sally. So, and you just mentioned it when you were starting first smoking the salmon, when there wasn't chilled distribution, when you didn't have a vacuum packer, and they used to be hanging in pubs. You obviously did you put more salt in? Like, have you
Yeah.
seen a reduction in the salting now?
Yeah, well, then I understood why this pamphlet from Tory said, dry salt it for 24 hours. I thought, And then 10 years after I'd started smoking fish and selling it, I thought the children were off then to secondary school. So Madam had a bit more time and my brain was crawling down my neck to strangle me. It was so bored with being a parrot. Would you tidy your bedroom, do your homework? Whose turn to wash up? You just become a bloody grumpy parrot. And I thought the brain needs some stimulating. So I went and studied with the Open University. I couldn't go to university. I live out in the sticks in West Cork. I've got 2 children I'm responsible for and an absent partner because he's out at sea or he's on the pier mending gear. La la la. So I did Open University courses, and the first one was food production systems. So that was amazing. I can't emphasize highly enough how rewarding it is psychologically to engage with these courses. And yeah, you don't need to do the exams, but they set me a yardstick. I have to get this. I have to do this. So I did food production systems, which taught me about bacterial activity, what the salt was doing, what the smoke was doing, what the desiccation was doing, how that was giving me a more stable food product, starting with a product that's very unstable and needs really careful and very rapid treatment. You got to get them cold really quickly. You got to handle them carefully because bruising occurs. So for a long time, the handling was dreadful, and you'd buy your salmon and you'd fillet them, and there'd be a bloody great big bruise right through the middle of the fillet, where the fish had gone into the net and got a bit stuck, and then however it was being removed, it was bruising the flesh.
We mentioned the cheeses there and the farmers markets, and it's pretty much a revolution I think we've seen in the last 20 years, probably in
Yeah,
terms of Irish
30, 40
attitudes to
years. Yeah,
food and producers and artisans like yourself.
yeah,
And we hear about farm to fork and all that, in terms of the provenance and where the produce comes. But the focus has always been on the land.
yeah.
And yet, so despite the revolution, despite all the great things being done, and as an island nation, it's like we've turned a blind eye completely
Oh,
to what's
totally.
happened out in the sea. And
Yeah,
and it must be maddening for you because you're having to deal with produce that
yeah.
has suffered in terms of the wild numbers. And then what you're seeing in terms of salmon farms. Like, why do you think that is that there's such a kind of like, and again, you talked about the EEC,
Yeah.
and when Ireland joined, it was, probably it was mainly farmer politicians or politicians with farming background, and the focus was on farming.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that there's such a kind of a blind eye being turned to the sea and marine and all that side of things, of which salmon obviously is a big part?
Oh, there's something that occupies my brain many, many evenings. Is it because we have our capitals, our centres of government are kind of inland? Certainly here, you'd be looking towards Dublin, so you're definitely not looking out to the sea. I did ask somebody in BIM last year. I said, "Has anybody calculated what the value to the Irish economy could have been over the last 50 years since we gave away 95% of the fish?" Now, I'll get hit for that because certain populations of different fish, but the pelagics, the herring and the mackerel, our quotas for those two species, because there was a lot of political input, thankfully, in some ways, in Killybegs to have a much greater quota. So mackerel and herrings, the Irish fleet would probably get between 12 and 17% of the total allowable catch of those species in Irish waters. But they're low value species. So you weren't going to make your millions, or some did. You weren't going to make your millions out of those populations of fish that you were allowed to have a slightly greater take of. But there's been all sorts of eruptions lately because the mackerel quota for this country is allocated to everybody. It's allocated to the super trawlers and the guy with the punt who's a registered fisherman. They're all having to share the same pot, but the inshore small boats are given such a pittance of quota. I mean, it's hardly worth their while going out after mackerel. So it's all, the emphasis is on big stuff. And in fact, I've had to do a lot of business training. I wouldn't have any business background, training for teaching, primary school. And so doing the business training courses, the emphasis from the many training courses that I did, and I'm eternally grateful to them, but they all said, oh, you have to grow your business. And I'm looking at fish populations starting to go, ooh, off the edge of the cliff. And I'm thinking, right, so do I go to Fortnum's? Because we won an amazing award in 2006 at the Great Taste Awards in the UK, because we were selling. Those were the days when you could sell to the UK without any of this faff that goes on now. I've eliminated the UK virtually from sales because Brexit and customs, and it's a nightmare. It's an
Nightmare.
absolute nightmare, and it's a nonsense as well. Anyway, that aside, business training, grow your business. And I thought, well, I can't. Fish populations fluctuate all the time. I had no mass whatsoever on playing with farmed fish. I'd seen them, and I was at fisheries exhibitions in Glasgow because the fisherman husband wanted to go to fishery. So I tagged along because I'm back in Scotland. And I was really surprised to see BP there. They had a big stand. And I thought, BP? Is this them hiving off profits, investing in salmon farms so that they can make a loss on the salmon farm and it reduces their tax liability for their other activity?
And just remind people, BP, you're talking about British Petroleum.
I am. And you know why they were there? Because they had discovered that you could grow a single-celled protein on the waxy substrate from the oil refining industry that they could scuff up, form in a ball, add a bit of dye, add some hormone, feed it to salmon. So those fish that you used to see, I mean, 40 years ago, you'd see this great white wodge of fat between the muscle bundles, and the fish, frankly, texture was slimy, not at all pleasant on the palate. That practice stopped. Probably, I don't know. I used to see beautiful sides of salmon, and for me, the best bit is the fatty bit of the belly, because that's the reserve, the reserve of energy that the fish has built up out in 2,000, 3,000 kilometers away. They gorge themselves on capelin and krill and those kind of oily little creatures. The krill gives them the color in the flesh. Capelin, which are oily little things like a herring. Humans don't eat them, I don't think. Certainly not here. Anyway, the fish put on weight and put on fats by consuming vast quantities of those, and that gives them the fuel to run back. There seems a body clock that when they've eaten, something switches on and they go, right, time to go back and do the important bit, the reproductive bit.
So just mentioning of krill and herring there, do you think that's part of the big issue that's going on in terms of the overfishing that's going on with these massive factory ships that they're hoovering up so much in the water that a big part of it is the small fish that the salmon feed on are actually being hoovered up as well?
Absolutely. Because krill, it's minute little creatures. They're like little sandhoppers that you see on the beach. So if you're going to catch those in volume, you're going to have to use either very fine mesh or hoover them, And if you're if you're fishing in the area where the salmon feed, guess what? You're going to be hoovering up juvenile salmon as well, or possibly adults and converting them into pellets. I mean, for a while, and I can't remember, was it in the 80s or the early 90s when we were filleting fish one morning and filleted hundreds and hundreds of salmon, zip up the belly, flip the fish over, and this particular day outshot undigested sand eels. And I'm going, you're so shocked to see anything in the gut of a salmon. You freeze them whole because they're not feeding when they come back to Irish coasts, to any coast. So you don't freeze them. There's no active digestive juices in the body at all, unless they've been starved of feeding out in the Atlantic and they're eating on the beach by the time they get back to their native river or nascent river. So I asked Dr. Whelan about that. I'd have contact with Ken Whelan. He's just one of my superheroes, actually. He's a wonderful man. And I've known him for decades. Any problem or any issue about salmon, Ken.
Yeah.
So I rang Ken and I said, Ken, why am I filleting salmon that have got active digestive juices in them? There's undigested sand eels in them. I'm having to cut the bellies and the fish away, even though they've been frozen, because that digestive juice is so aggressive and active that it's eating the belly wall and the fish in the freezer. It hasn't gone to sleep like the rest of it. It's still working. And he was president of NASCO at the time. Hallelujah. Good man in that job. And he got quite irate and he used language that I'd never heard Ken use before. There was an active fishery for krill in the Atlantic, in the North Atlantic, in the middle of our North Atlantic. Norwegian vessels were fishing for krill. And as you rightly pointed out, if they're fishing for krill to make pellets for salmon farms, Oh, and krill supplement for the cat and krill pellets for me, please. And that's incredibly wasteful. I mean, through my work with slow fish and my friends in North America, the fisheries people there, the fishers there, it takes between 3.5 and 5 kilos of wild fish harvested from the wild to put 1 kilo of weight on a fish in a cage. I can see the sort of where they're coming from ish. That when I brought it up with fisheries officers when I'm being inspected here, and I'd be asking them difficult questions like, why are they allowing fishing in Antarctica, where I thought it was a protected haven for blue whales? Why are we as humans allowing that? Why are we as humans allowing enormous fisheries for anchovety off the west coast of Africa? Humans in those countries eat those fish. That's their sustenance. And here we've got foreign boats going in, hoovering it all up, leaving those people with nothing to eat. They're not going to be able to afford farmed fish. The fisheries officers told me on one occasion when I said, I think it's ludicrous that they're allowing this. Oh, people in China need food. I'm afraid I railed. And I said, do you know there's kids sleeping on the streets in Dublin? We've got to look after our own before we worry about a population on the other side of the planet.
Yeah, I was going to ask you because we just touched on it there, Sally. Like you'd have been working through a period when salmon farming came on the scene, and I
Yeah,
kind of like I was young, but I remember it was kind of like it was seen as a great white hope almost. That this
yeah.
was going to be, bring on. It was going to save our wild stocks. It was going to feed the people, as you said. I mean, did you see it as that as well? And if so, how quick did you realize that it wasn't all rosy in the garden?
I think it started when I saw the BP salmon feed.
You
And
smelt
I
a
thought,
rat.
no, this is intrinsically wrong.
Yeah.
I felt it was immoral, actually. It, bit of wool pulling. The other thing that really turned me off was GM was quite the thing when I was younger, in the day. And I was in the when we had a fisherman's co-op in Skib, and I was in one day picking something up, and they said, "Come here, will you come and buy some of these salmon?" And I said, "I'll have a look." And this was coming up to St. Patrick's Day, and I was shown these fish. Oh, we've got these from this farm, and we've been playing with the genetics, trying to switch on the red color, and red and green being opposites. You'd switch one on and the other off, genetically speaking. I did try and understand it from the genetics, but it was a bit complex. What they showed me was a salmon, looked like a salmon, but it was Kelly green. The skin was bright green. The flesh was white. So they're or whitish. It wasn't white, it was sort of murky color. They had switched on the wrong put on the wrong switch. I said, I'm not working with salmon that look like they've been created for specifically for St. Patrick's Day. So that's gross.
Frankenfish.
Yeah.
Frankenfish. Yeah, before that was penned. Thank God they've been put out of
Um,
business.
it's and again, this is something we've kind of railed about is salmon farms
Yeah,
and the damage
the
that they.
escapees. I mean, just today, we've known this on the inside track for a long time that those escapees, right, I'll take it right back to the 1980s. Dr. Whelan had an associate in inland fisheries at the time called Kevin Lenane, and was the sea angling officer and a really dear friend, an amazing man. He made films for the Central Fisheries Board, Inland Fisheries, about salmon all around the North Atlantic. He went to Iceland and filmed them ranching wild salmon. He went to the Faroes. I think he was rejected from somewhere. He went Denmark because he'd spoken out about the Greenland fisheries, which belong to Denmark. Here we had I think it was 6 mile limit that you couldn't fish salmon beyond 6 miles from the coast. In Greenland, 80 miles from the coast was their cutoff. So obviously you would be fishing salmon in the areas where the salmon were feeding. They weren't migratory. They were kind of static and feeding. So he was a bit cross about that, and he spoke about it. So then next time he went to Denmark, he wasn't allowed in with his cameras. But he went to Norway and he sent me papers in the 1980s. That's where the salmon farming arose. They took adult returning fish from several Norwegian rivers, stripped the eggs and milk, brought them on in hatcheries, and then banged them in cages. So after they got over the issues of when the female fish in the cage was reaching sexual maturity, she'd stop feeding because she's stuck, and her whole instinct is to get into the freshwater and reproduce. She couldn't do that, so she'd stop feeding. She'd absorb the eggs back into her body and pine. But they noticed the males didn't lose it, so they started putting male hormone in the pellets so that all the fish. What they've done is just anyway. Lovely. When those fish escaped, as they would, and they escaped from Scotland's farms, they escaped from farms here, they escaped from farms everywhere around Norway. Some of those progeny were going back to the rivers that their parent had come from. Even if they'd escaped in Scotland, they'd know. So Kevin sent me these papers that said that in the mid-1980s, up to 80% of the fish returning to some rivers in Norway were escapees from farms. And they're now one step removed from that incredible instinct. So, and now we've got these ones that have escaped here, interfering with the reproduction and the genetic integrity of fish in Irish rivers. The cockfish can cover loads of hens, and a really small male fish, one that looks far too piddly and silly to be of any consequence, when the female's in the red and the big cockfish with his cape ready to beat off anybody else, he's so consumed with protecting his female and making sure his milk hits those eggs that he's oblivious to these cheeky little cockfish that come zipping in underneath and they fertilize the eggs under his nose. That's the kind of thing that we're most concerned about, that those little escapee males will interfere with the genetic integrity just going forwards, not just on this breeding, because, that's you altering the genetics of millions of years, at least 10,000 years. I'm being a bit extravagant, but the salmon have been there for thousands and thousands of years.
But it's happened already, Sally,
It has, yeah.
This is guaranteed. There's been fish escapes before, and then, I'm sure what we don't know as well in terms of what's gotten there.
We can't even see the consequences yet. The consequences, as you said, Sally, are far more far-reaching.
Yeah, we've no concept of it. I mean, when the fish escaped from Bantry, I remember many years ago, that was a tragedy. 250,000 fish, and not small. Oh, they won't be able to feed. They'll be washing up dead on the beaches. No. And the department said every effort will be made to round these fish up, which had me, sorry, frankly, for a moment in hysterical laughter. I mean, we're not cowboys. How are you you can't whistle. You can't round them up once they're it's the genie out of the bottle.
Exactly. And,
if you talk nicely and ask them, they'll come back.
Yeah, whistle. Strangely, there was an activity, I think it was in Japan, where they were ranching, but instead of allowing them offshore, when they were still in the juvenile freshwater bit, they would ring a bell when they dropped pellets in the tank. So when they released them into the ocean, they had big buoys in bays with feeding platforms on them. And the same, they would ring the bell on the platform and salmon would come up to the platform to feed. So instead of containing them in a cage and all the detritus falling in one place, eutrophication, blah, 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 blah. Sorry, you know it. The salmon were sort of semi-wild. They were eating pellet, but they were also eating wild stuff. They're not stupid. They're extremely carnivorous. So, they're very active feeders. So some of them would be kind of wild.
Sorry, did that work?
It did work.
But how did they stop predation then? How did they stop predation coming?
It happens. Predation happens. If you've got enough there, you have to just go with it. It's natural. It's normal. Kevin told me when they first started farming, when they had the juvenile fish in the tanks on the land, they were so used to seeing humans because the humans were coming and feeding them that they weren't afraid of anything. So he said we had to go to great lengths to frighten salmon so that if they saw a seal or an otter or a human, they'd run away or swim away.
Despite everything we know, Sally, in terms of the sea lice, the danger to wild stock,
all these new viruses,
the crap that they're fed, the pellets, where that comes from. The Department of Agriculture still has an official policy of developing and expanding salmon farms and aquaculture in Ireland. And it's, and they're relying, we've mentioned this before, they're relying on an outdated, discredited scientific paper to try and back up their dinosaur theories.
Yep.
So what can people do? Is it about education? And I mentioned earlier, we had this food revolution and people won't touch any food if it's anyway tainted or comes from any kind of crap to do with the land. But yet these same people have, when I'm talking chefs, I'm talking food sellers, food producers, have no problem dealing with crap from the sea. So
but the crap from the sea has got that golden ticket. It calls itself organic. And that's something that really irritates me.
Please put the nail in the coffin of that, please.
That just drives me insensible. I did meet somebody from a huge multinational, international farming business at the fisheries conference in Galway one year. And I and some of my salmony friends that were involved with Slow Food had, we were trying to get that this Irish wild salmon needed protection from Europe, needed to be separated off from the farm stuff. If we could change the nomenclature of that thing in a cage, it definitely doesn't fulfill any of the criteria of a wonderful, free-swimming, extraordinary wild salmon. It's the same Latin name, Salmo salar. There's another little group of friends in the UK, excuse me, and we're pushing to have the nomenclature changed to Salmo domesticus. And then there can be no confusion.
Yeah.
At the moment, the confusion is huge, especially when they get that organic ticket dangling on it. So at the fisheries thing, I discovered that this particular farm had got a PDO, PGI. And I go, what? And they turned us down as for the wild ones. What the hell's going on here? So I said to this guy, I said, how the hell? I'm afraid I grabbed his tie, lads. I was so irate. Never done it in my life before. How did you get away with that? And I said, you put dye in it. For me, I buy organic food because I feel that it's not tainted with chemicals and part of its, the growing cycle or the production cycle. And he looked a bit shocked and he said, oh, but it's a nature equivalent dye. And you just think, I just don't get this. So I've been battling that quietly for a while, but I made myself so unpopular with authority with anything to do with fish that for a long time I just thought I'd have to shut up about this. But I'm back on it because I do feel that it's pulling the wool over people's eyes. A learned authority told me that up to 80% of the public think that organic fish is wild.
But I'd say, Sally, nearly 100% of people who buy farm
changing.
salmon.
Thanks be to God.
It's slowly, but you still look at the sales of farm salmon. People have no idea.
Outrageous. Yeah,
to me, it reminds me, it's like the oil industry or the tobacco industry back in the day, that they're fighting their corner with lies and obfuscation and false science where and how they can. and eventually, it'll take another generation, like, will we start to see, pictures of salmon being eaten by the lice, that maybe pictures like that, like the cigarettes should go on the packet and go, right, this is
Yeah.
what you're buying. But
You're worse than me.
jeez.
Like it. I like it a lot.
But you need to shock people, I think,
You do.
But can I ask you though, Sally, in terms of, are you conflicted as a wild
Always.
fish smoker
Always.
because the numbers are such,
Yep.
like, and I don't mean this in a bad, I'm just saying,
No, I hear
will
you.
people go, well, hold on a sec, why is she talking about saving, the state of salmon when, she's willingly using wild salmon?
If nobody uses it, then it just vanishes. Do you know what I'm saying? If we're not having this conversation, they don't exist. We're having this conversation because they still exist. And if I stopped doing and talking about what I'm doing, if I stopped all that, salmon would just disappear into the mists of time and they wouldn't exist anymore. So on one of the slow fish events in 2019, some of the students from Slow Foods University of Gastronomy who come and spend a month to 6 weeks with me. I take interns and educate them. They come and live under my roof and they learn about the fish. And it's brilliant because they're the bright young things. They're master's students in their 20s. They're beginning life's process. If we can get clear information into them, and they do get that from Slow Foods University, because the university is not sponsored by pharmaceutical industry or chemical industries, or which many other educational facilities and institutions are funded by industry, which means that the research is all going in one favorable direction. Do you know what I mean?
Hmm.
So they wanted me to bring the salmon. They wanted me, because Charles Clover, you mentioned him, had attacked slow fish for slow food for promoting an endangered species, and we're going, yeah, we know it's endangered. That's why we're here. We're trying to broaden out the conversation so that more people are informed about the plight of the salmon, and it's largely to do with water quality in the freshwater system. This was before climate change started to impinge on where the fish are feeding, because the nutrient-rich currents from the Arctic are changing direction because of warming oceans. So the fish are not heading they're not getting feeding in the same places that they used to. So we took one of the fishermen along with us. So we had, one of the commercial men from the Blackwater. So we had the catcher and the processor and the fish. And that was an amazing event. And the fisherman, Mikey, was saying to me when we were coming home, he said, Jesus, he said, we've had this rankling between we commercial fishermen who are allowed a third of the quota from rivers that have any volume over, minimum sustainable yield. Thank God this country's ahead of the posse when it came to DNA fingerprinting salmon and analysing returns into individual rivers. We still need more fish counters because it's all a little bit grey. But, Mikey was saying coming home, Christ, he said, we're all on the same side of the fence. He said the anglers are as interested in keeping the fish in the rivers and keeping the whole system rolling as we are, as commercial men who've got damn all else coming in. Do you know that it's really hard for them? It's not a leisure activity for the commercial drift net, snap net men. Sorry, wrong net. Draft and snap net men on the river. It's damned hard work. It's low water twice a day, Monday to Friday. So you're not sleeping properly, so you can't undertake another occupation. But with the numbers shrinking, and the last few summers have been quite dry, so there's been very few fish able to get into the river. And then you have the incident at the water plant, oh God, in up the river, up one of the tributaries, the Blackwater. They killed 5,000 fish, a release of something from a water treatment plant on the I've forgotten the name of the river. Is it the Allow River?
The
It's
Allow
a
River in
yeah,
Kanturk,
it's a
wasn't it?
tributary
Yeah.
of the Blackwater, and you're just going, the flipping poor fish. They smell their body of water out at sea. So one assumes that was either chlorine or aluminium sulfate or something really delicious that went into the river, changed the chemical smell of it. So, they had several blank days last summer, and you're going, this can't be happening. And they know that the fish have altered their whole cycle. They're not coming back last week in June, first 2 weeks in July. And the Kamchatkan men pointed that out, that their fish were running late. And you're thinking, oh, my God. What is interesting, I have enormous time in my life with some amazing human beings. Mark Boyden is another one. He has a Streamscapes over near Bantry, and that's an educational facility. Many years ago now, Mark ranched wild salmon from that facility, and he did it for 7 years. And he said the problem with ranching is, yes, it increases the numbers. It's protecting the egg from egg to little tiny smolt, when it's ready to think about adapting to the river and then taking off to sea. So he had small fry festivals, absolutely amazing, brilliant. He'd give the children a jam jar with tiny little fish, which had got to the point where they'd absorbed the yolk sac, and they'd take that jar of fish down, and each individual child, 5 and 6-year-olds, would release those into the river, having been informed over time when that little aquarium that was in the school classroom with the eggs in it, and as they were developing, Mark organised individuals to go in and talk to the children about how important it is that the streams and the rivers be kept clean to protect these little things. Absolutely brilliant, so subversive and so beautiful and so gentle. Because, if it's your child going, Daddy, you can't wash the slurry tank out in the stream, that means something.
Well, I always say it's my kids, if we go to a restaurant, they'll see the menu and they'll see the salmon and they go, Dad, is that a farm salmon? I go, it is. And they go,
yeah, it is.
So
Yeah.
if my 10-year-old knows about it, that's a start at least.
It is a start, because we're all too old for it now. Mark was saying to me recently, he stopped the ranching because those returning fish are coming into the rivers where there are, if I could call them indigenous fish, because it's not like escapees from the farm, but we humans select out what we perceive to be the most powerful, the best ones for reproducing. But Mark was saying to me the last few years, he said, Sal, what we need are the ones that come back at weird times, or they're the skinny fish, or they're the ones that aren't conforming to the general norm, because they'll be the survivors, because their genetics are a wee bit different. And I find that intriguing. He calls them, without being in any way racist or in any way castigating, he calls them black fish, like black sheep, or he's the black sheep of the family. It's not.
Yeah.
So Mark says that we've got to try and encourage the blackfish, because when those fish that we encourage, when we protect them and allow more out to sea, and they feed themselves and they come back as totally wild fish, no human interference except at the very beginning of their life cycle.
We're all custodians. People are, we're all interested. We all anglers, we're all, anybody involved with the process. We're all custodians of it.
What's happened in society, and it's happened across the board, they've broken us into little groups, kind of self-interest groups, who squabble. If we put the big grown-up shoes on and we said, right, we're all concerned about this as all these little diverse groups, if we can pull ourselves together, then we stand some chance of getting the rivers cleaned up. That would make a huge difference, an enormous difference. I remember saying to Kevin Linane years ago, when he was down, he'd come round, and Colin was sea angling, so anything unusual would be recorded in the angler's log, and Kevin would come, and I said, God, isn't that amazing, Kevin? There's no photographs of fish kills on the rivers anymore. The papers used to be every couple of weeks there'd be an awful photograph of salmon and trout and, oh, God knows what else, floating belly up in rivers because of a spill, if it was not a pig plant or, la, 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 la. So many toxins allowed into the rivers. The one that really gets me is the invisible one. It's the house. God, forgive me, I live in the country. I've got a septic tank. But if you live in a city and you're using this biological washing powder in your washing machine, you're using that chemical cleaner down the loo, you're using this one in the sink, all the houses in that street, all the houses in those urban environments are all adding chemical compounds to bodies of water, and we don't talk about it. And it really irritates me when I see certain big chemical industries, here's your solution to bugs in the kitchen. And you're thinking, yeah, but it's not going to stop after it's gone down the plug hole. It's going to be continuing out till it reaches the sea. So we need to get our act together and stop the pollution in freshwater systems. If we just give Mother Nature a little assistance by backing off, it's extraordinary how she'll resolve things. I watched a little film from fisheries, North America, and they've had issues with dams and tailings from mining exercises, la la la. This fisheries and game man, instead of stocking the rivers with the smolts, which then compete for food with your indigenous fish, so you're not actually helping anybody, because the ones that have been brought on are probably slightly more carnivorous. They've had to fight for their food with greater numbers, so they're more avaricious. It's competition for feed. So your indigenous ones are not going to get the feed. This one fish and game guy said when they'd removed a dam further down the river, he said, we're going to do nothing, lads. We're going to do nothing. We've taken out the impediment to the fish getting here. Let's sit back and wait and see. Within 18 months, there were all 5 species of North American salmonids back in that river by themselves. Not by themselves, Mother Nature. She's amazing, but it's human intervention that's caused all the trouble. So if we just acknowledge that we've made a bit of a mess of things, back off and let Mother Nature rebalance, because we've knocked everything out of equilibrium. So if we start with the fresh water, we're 73% water. If the water's not fit for a salmon to live in, should we be drinking it? Do you know what I'm saying?
I do, and I think we need more Sally Barnes to be calling it as it is. You remind me of you're the Irish West Cork Alex Morton.
Thank you. I'm not very popular, I have to tell you.
Well, then you're doing a good job.
You're doing something right.
I've got to this stage in my life where I think, oh, for God's sake, somebody's got to call it out. And I'm going to call it out because I've seen it happening over my 50 years living and working here. You totally remind me of Alex Morton. And Alex Morton, when I interviewed her for the last salmon, she made a good point. She said it's actually, in terms of the protests and, actually taking action, she sees it's actually the kind of older generation, because the kids are growing up. You actually have a bit of time. You've kind of lived life. You've seen things. Sure, what have you got to lose? Kind of, exactly.
that was her point.
Well, yes, I've gone through that. Actually, 3 square a day. I don't have to prepare it. I get my sheets changed every week or 2. And I could read. So being locked up at this stage might be quite nice. Not that I'm asking.
No,
it has its plus points.
It must have its plus points. But I do feel that because we've all been dispersed and made to think, oh, the grass is greener on his side of the fence, I want a bit of that action. I feel that we should put the big adult shoes on and go, well, actually, we have more power if we pull together on this one.
Oh, very true. Sally, I could talk to you all day about this. I think we'll have to do a follow-up sometime to put the world to right.
Come and visit and come and do a course with me. I'd be thrilled.
I'll tell you, for people who want to find out more, where do they go? What's the website and what do you do?
It's woodcocksmokery.com. I run now because it's so hard to find fish. All fish populations are crashing, or it's a combination of that, and the boats are out for so long now. By the time they get back to the shore, that fish isn't fresh enough for me to play with. I need sparkling fish. God be with the days of the day boat. When I was married to commercial fishermen, it was great. It was day fish. Now it's 4 and 5 days because they've got to go so far off. So the quality is not quite the same. So I'm teaching. Those who can do, I've gone right round the clock. I'm right back to where I started, but it's teaching adults, which is so much easier because adults want to know.
Well, and by the sounds of it, there's a whole lot to be learned as well. So
there is.
So look, woodcocksmokery.com is the website for
.com, and I'm running. The courses are up on the site now. I don't run them all the time, obviously. I mean, as you get a bit older, you go, oh, crikey. But I do a salmon course, and I teach people over 2.5 days the ins and outs and wherewithal of salmon. And we go over and we visit Mark Boyden. So they're getting the bigger picture. Mark has done most of the catchments for, at least 25 rivers in this country. And he's combining, he pulls everybody together in that catchment, and he points out what might impact the quality of the river in the bottom of that catchment. So trying to make a consolidated effort to clean up rivers. It's brilliant.
Sally, thanks again for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you down there in West Cork sometime.
Doors open.
Our thanks to Sally for joining us on the show. And don't forget to rate, review and follow the Ireland on the Fly podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from.
Plus, you can keep up to date on IrelandOnTheFly.com as well as on Instagram, and myself and Tom will be back with another episode about the people and places of fly fishing in Ireland.